Hey everyone, we're going to see how to containerize a Node.js RESTful API application. So the scope of this is actually we're going to build a Node.js application, a very simple one. We're going to containerize it, so we're going to build a Docker image from it, and then we're going to deploy it as a container, whether that be a remote server or, in my case, my local machine. So this API is actually going to be communicating with the database. It's going to be using Couchbase Server, which is an open source NoSQL database. I currently have Couchbase Server running as a Docker container. I made a tutorial about this previously on creating a custom Couchbase Server image and then deploying it. You don't have to use a Docker container for your NoSQL database or any database for that matter. You can run it locally or directly on your host machine or any other machine. But we will make sure that our container can communicate to it. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create a new Node.js project. So we can say make directory node-project. So I'm creating a node project directory on my desktop. I'm going to navigate into this directory and I'm going to say npm init --y. So what that's going to do is it's going to create a package.json file, and that's going to hold all of our dependencies. So before we install any dependencies, let's go ahead and create a file called app.js. So we're going to say touch app.js. And if you're not comfortable using the command line, you can absolutely create these by hand, but I'm familiar with the command line, so it's very easy for me. So as of right now, we should have an app.js file and a package.json file. We do need to set up which dependencies we wish to use in this project. So we're going to say npm install, we're going to say express Couchbase, we're going to say body parser, and we're going to say UUID, and we're going to say ---- save. So the point here is we're going to be using Express Framework for our API. We're going to use the Couchbase SDK for communicating with the database. We're going to use body parser for allowing bodies inside of our HTTP requests, particularly our post request. And then we're going to use UUID for generating unique keys for our NoSQL documents. So I'm going to hit save. So it just did install all of the dependencies. Now when we get there, we're not going to be transferring these dependencies. We're going to install them fresh. But at least if we wanted to test it locally, we could. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear my terminal, and I'm going to open this project in my editor of choice. So in this case, I'm going to be using Atom by GitHub. Let's go ahead and close all of these files. We're going to be focusing in the app.js file, and we're going to start by importing the dependencies that we had just installed. So with these dependencies included, now we can initialize Express. So we're going to say var app equals express. And we're also going to say app.use body parser .json. So we're going to be able to accept JSON bodies inside of our HTTP requests. Before we get ahead of ourselves and get into the Couchbase or the API endpoint generation, let's go ahead and start our server. So we're going to say var server equals, and we're going to say app.listen, and we're going to say 3000 function. And once it's connected, we're going to print out the following. So we're going to say console.log, and we're going to say listening on port, and we're going to say plus server.address.port, and then ... or whatever message you really want to print out. But I just want to know that it's listening on that port when we start our application. All right, so now we can actually focus on getting our application working, and then we're going to work on Dockerizing it or containerizing it, however you want to put it. So we're going to say var n1ql, so nickel query equals Couchbase dot n1ql query, and we're doing this because we plan on using nickel queries in our API, and this will allow us to run SQL queries against Couchbase. So this is a Couchbase specific thing, not a Node thing, not a Docker thing. Once we've included that, let's go ahead and establish a connection to our Couchbase instance. So we're going to say var bucket equals new Couchbase dot cluster, and we're going to provide it a cluster address, so Couchbase, and then one of the nodes in our cluster. So in this case, let's say localhost. and then we're going to say dot open bucket. We're providing it a bucket name, so I'll just say default, and it won't have a password. That's how mine is set up. Yours may be set up differently. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and say app.get the default endpoint, so function request response. I'm going to say response.send, and we're going to say try a different endpoint. So we're not going to have anything happen on the root endpoint, but we are going to add two more endpoints, one for getting data and one for creating data. So we're going to say app.get. Let's call this a get endpoint. It doesn't really matter what you name it. Function request response. We're going to construct our query, so we're going to say var query equals n1 ql query dot from string, and we're going to type in an actual query. So we're going to say select, and we're going to say backtick, and we're going to say bucket dot underscore name. So what we're doing here is we're saying give us the bucket name that we defined on line 11. We could actually type in default here, but it's best if we use variables in case they change. Dot asterisk, so wildcard from, and we're going to do backticks again, and we're going to do the same thing, bucket dot underscore name. And again, you can type it, you could hard code it if you want, you could do whatever you want, but this is probably the best approach. And we're going to close that off with a semicolon. Now we can actually run that query. So we're going to say bucket.query. We're going to pass in the query, and we're going to say function. We're going to say error result. If there was an error, what we're going to do is we're going to return. We're going to say response.status. Let's give it an error, maybe a 500 error. Send, and we're just going to send that error. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to say response.send result. So whatever the result was, which should be our data. The next endpoint we want to do is we want to say app.post. So this is a create request. And we're going to say save function request response. And we're really going to do pretty much a very similar thing. We're going to say bucket.insert uuid.v4. So we're going to create a uniquely generated key as our document key. We're going to say request.body. So we're going to save whatever is passed, and it doesn't matter. We're not doing any parsing. Function. We're going to say error result. And to save us a bit of time, I'm just going to copy what was above because it's going to be the same thing. So if there was an error, send an error. Otherwise, send the result and hit save. So in theory, if I run this, it should work. So let's give it a try. So we're going to say node app.js. So it's listening on port 3000. I do have Couchbase running. So before that, what we actually have to do is I'll have to stop this application, but we want to make sure that we do have a default bucket to match what we had entered. We also need to have one index created. Because we're using nickel queries, we need at least one index. The quick cheap way to do it is to do a primary index. In production, you won't want to do that because it'll be slow. But for our experimental purposes, we can. So we can say create primary index on default, execute it. It should be in our index list, at which point we can actually run queries against that bucket. So we won't need to restart it because it's just an index. But let's go ahead and hit our endpoint. So I hit the first endpoint. It says try a different endpoint like what we had decided. So if we type /get and I send it again, there are no results. So let's try a different one. So let's say /save, be a post request. Doesn't really matter what we send. Let's go ahead and send it. It should have saved it because we did get a non-error response. So if I refresh and I go to documents, that data is there. So we have a unique key from our UUID, and then we have the data that was saved. So now what we want to do is we want to break this down so it works as a container. So we actually want to build an image for this. So some code actually needs to have, some changes have to happen to the code. So going back, we're not going to be using localhost. If it's a container and we use localhost, well, that's localhost to the container. That won't. Chances are our database is not going to be on that container. So what we can actually do is we can actually use environment variables rather than hard coding these. And that's actually, if you saw the last tutorial I made on containerizing Couchbase, I actually did the same thing there as well. So let's remove localhost and say process.env, and let's say Couchbase host, and then let's go ahead and change this. So we'll say process.env.couchbase bucket, and then finally process.env.couchbase bucket password. And these could be named whatever you want. If we wanted to take a step further, we can also define a port on demand, which we probably should. So we'll say process.env.application port, and if they don't enter a port, we can use pipes and say if port doesn't exist, go ahead and default it on port 3000, and we can do that same thing for any of these environment variables. So we'll save it. As of right now, it should look good, and if we wanted to try it, let's stop our application, and we can actually say env. We can say Couchbase host equals localhost, Couchbase bucket equals default, Couchbase bucket password equals nothing, and then we'll use the default port and we'll say node app.js. So it did start. If I go back into my Postman tool or whatever you're using, maybe you're using Fiddler, let's go ahead and do a GET request, and it was able to get that data because it is connected to Couchbase as of right now through those environment variables. So that's great. Let's go ahead and stop it. And we're going to create two files as part of the process for Dockerizing this application. So we're going to say touch, and we're going to say Docker file with a capital D. And we're also going to say touch.docker ignore, so that way we don't transfer everything over. So inside the Docker ignore, let's start there. We don't want to transfer node modules, and we don't want to transfer Docker file in case there's sensitive stuff in there. We don't want people to be able to see it in case our container gets compromised. So we'll save it. Now we can go into our Docker file, and we can define how is this Docker container going to be modeled after. So we're going to say from node, and we can use the latest image. So that's the baseline image from the official node Docker hub. We're going to do copy. We're going to copy everything except for what's defined in the Docker ignore to the serve directory inside the container or inside the image. We're going to switch the working directory to the serve directory, and then we're going to run a build time command. So we're going to say run user/local/bin/npm install. So this is a build time command. So when we build this image, after it copies our package.json and our app.js file, it will do an install. So it'll get our node modules directory within the image itself. At runtime, we can say runtime through the cmd command. We're going to say user local bin node app.js, and that will run our app.js file. So let's go ahead and test this. So going back to our terminal, we can say docker build. Now I do have Docker installed. I didn't say this up front, but I'm using Docker for Mac. If you're using Docker for Windows, that works. If you're using Docker for Linux, that works too. If you're using Docker Toolbox, things may be different. So this is not based off Docker Toolbox. There probably will be some differences if you're using Docker Toolbox, which is for older versions of Windows, older versions of Mac. But we're going to say docker build -t for tag, and we're going to call it node custom. It could be really called whatever you want, but this is how we identify the image. Since we're within this working directory, we're just going to say dot because that's where our Docker file is, and we're going to hit enter. And what it's going to do is it's going to download all of those dependencies and build our image. All right, so we do now have a image in our list of images that we could publish if we wanted to, but we're not going to worry about that here. So what we want to do is we actually want to deploy that image. So we do have Couchbase still running as a container, which is fine. We can check it out by saying docker ps. So it is running. What we want to do now is we want to run this Docker image as a container. So we can say docker run. We're going to run it in detached mode. We're going to say -p. For port, we're going to say 3000. So we're mapping the container port to our host machine's port. So we want them to match up. They don't have to, but in this case they will. We're going to say E for environment variable, and we're going to say Couchbase host equals. So you'll notice that my container name for Couchbase is Couchbase. So I'm going to use Couchbase. If you're using, in this case, your local computer probably won't work because the container won't know how to access the local host. They won't be the same. But if you have Couchbase or your database deployed somewhere like Amazon or Digital Ocean, you can just use that, your IP or whatever, wherever it's hosted instead, and it'll be fine. But because I have another Docker container, they're going to sit side by side. I can use the container name, which is also the host name. So Couchbase. I'm going to type in another environment variable, Couchbase bucket. That's default. And then E for Couchbase, I can't spell, Couchbase bucket password. And that's going to be blank. But what we also want to do, what we'll actually do is we'll type in the port as well. So we'll say application port equals 3000. So again, this is a Docker thing, but Docker has its own networking. So we need to make sure that this Node.js application is running on the same network as our Couchbase container. So we can define the network. I know for a fact that I have my Couchbase container running on the bridge network. So I also want my Node.js application to run on that same network. You won't have this issue if your database is not in a container. If it is in a container, you definitely want your networks to match. We're going to give it a name. Let's call this Node.js project maybe. And we're going to say this uses the Node custom image. So if everything works all right, if I hit enter, it should work out fine. So it started, and we can confirm that it's running by saying docker logs -f. That'll follow it. And then the actual container name, which we called Node.js project. It says listening on port 3000. I'm actually inside of the what's happening inside of the container right now. But I'll exit out of that just for proof because I am in detached mode. It's still running in the background. I'll say docker ps. So Couchbase and Node are running. In theory, if I hit the get endpoint, it should not crash. And it did crash. So let's figure out what's going on. So it actually didn't work because I had messed up my container network, which is fine. So instead, what I've gone ahead and I've done, and I'll go ahead and stop it. So I'll say docker rmf Node.js project. So I'm going to stop this container. So the first thing what I did was I said docker inspect Couchbase. So that's my other running container. And instead of using the host name, what I did was I got the IP address of that particular container. So I copied it, and then I ran that creation command again. So I'll go up a few times. So what I did was instead of using Couchbase as the Couchbase host, I used the actual IP, and I ran it. I still maintain the same network as well. So after I ran it, I was able to successfully use the API. So these are two Docker containers communicating to each other without issue. So the result of that issue was just related to how I had configured my Docker network. So you just saw how to create a Node.js application that communicated to Couchbase Server, so a NoSQL database. I used environment variables so that way I didn't have to hard code anything. Everything could be passed in on the fly. I built a Docker image using a Docker file, so I copied the package.json and app.js file over. I installed the dependencies, and then I ran that application, and they were able to communicate to each other. So The whole process isn't that difficult. It can be a little tricky trying to understand all of the container networks and things like that, but it really isn't that bad, and the learning curve isn't too bad either.